Good afternoon. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy at the City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. Today is February 14th, Tuesday. Welcome to our office hour and lecture period. We have quite a bit of material to cover tonight, so I'm just going to get right into it. So this week we begin a discussion of how global trade is managed among nations. And we will conclude next week with a review of the institutions that have been set up since World War II to manage global trade, their histories, and their different roles. We will mention those very quickly in today's, as you may have noticed in the as part of the assessment for this week. I'll go over those just, the highlights of them. So as such, the learning objectives for this module includes to differentiate between different errors in the theory of trade and their underlying themes. So there is, obviously, we are the age of globalization in many ways than one. There was a degree of globalization to the industrial era, but this era of globalization is unique in that there are global and international institutions that undergird the rules of what we call a rules-based international system. But if we were to head back a little bit, we would encounter, this is going to the 17th century, we would encounter what is called the mercantilist period. And the origin of international political economy are closely associated with the development of the modern European states and their global markets. So the modern European state gained official recognition at the Treaty of 1648, Treaty of Westphalia, which marked the defeat of Catholic Habsburg countries by mostly Protestant countries in Northern Europe. The Peace of Westphalia upheld state sovereignty and territorial integrity by institutionalizing changes to prevent external religious and secular authorities. Example, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and other states from interfering in a state's internal affairs. A major factor enabling the state to establish its authority vis-a-vis internal and external forces was the development of mercantilism. Mercantilists were actually aware of the linkage between politics and economics. Note the reference and close relationship with the name of the class, Global Trade and Political Economy. So mercantilists were acutely aware of the linkage between politics and economics, viewing both power and wealth as essential goals of national policy. The mercantilist states could use their wealth to build up their armed forces, hire mercenaries, influence their enemies and allies. Thus, they accumulated gold and silver by seeking trade advantages over others in the following ways. They increased their exports and decreased their imports of manufactured goods. They restricted raw materials and technology exports to prevent others from developing manufacturing capabilities and imported raw material they needed to reduce costs for their own manufacturers. So you can see how this was the wild, wild west of globalization, where there were no rules except might makes right in many ways. Colonialism was central to mercantilism because the colonies provided the metropole with raw materials. So the colonies provided the colonial powers with raw materials and served as markets for their manufactured. Thus, manufacturing in the colonies was usually prohibited. So a number of things that I find interesting. If you were to go to the Caribbean or British Anglophone West Africa, or the Indian subcontinent. There are common goods that you would see in those countries up until today that are derived from their shared British colonization. So you will see popularity of Lipton tea. You would see, up till today, you will see popularity of things like Bonvita or Ovaltine or otherwise Nestle-made products. And these products continue to control big market share up until today. And these are some of the after effects of colonialism. But right past after the mercantilist period came the next period, which is considered the Industrial Revolution and British hegemony. Mercantilism, as the term is used in the class textbook, is pre-industrial doctrine. The Industrial Revolution, which began about 1780, affected only some manufacturers and means of production, and initially progressed from region to region rather than involving entire countries. However, Britain became the hegemonic power in the 19th century as it was the first state to industrialize. By 1860, this is really fascinating how Britain so dominated the global economy. By 1860, Britain accounted for about 37% of European industrial production, 20% of world industrial production, and 80% of newer technology industries. Britain shifted from mercantilist policies towards free trade. It removed most of the industrial trade restrictions by the 1830s, and indeed by 1846, it repealed the Corn Laws, which had restricted agricultural imports. Britain began to understand, and this was not out of altruism. Britain understood that for it to make money, it needed affluent customers. And these became the foundation of some of the concepts that we're going to cover in the class today. But we'll get to that in a second. But I need for you to be clear about what Britain's motivation was. It was not altruism. It was actually building on the knowledge that it now had about how globalization worked, recognizing that just as any other store, and in this case, we're thinking about it in terms of a national economy, for you to sell goods and services to the world has to have the capacity to purchase those goods and services. And that would mean that those countries would also need some economic dynamism to them to be able to create the labor force to consume what Britain was selling to them. Even so, the decline of the British hegemony and World War I, that was the next period. So growth of trade became slower in the late 19th century because of the depressed European economic conditions. Industrial protectionism on the European continent and a decline of British hegemony. A decrease in Britain's productivity relative to the United States and Germany made it less competitive in trade and less able to serve as a market for other countries' exports. So if the Brits themselves, their productivity diminishes, then the purchasing power of their citizens would also decrease as a result. And we're going to talk about how this may have influenced our ancestral countries and some of the other foreign countries that we're aware of. And it made, because the Brits then had less purchasing power, they became less competitive in trade and less able to serve as a market for other countries' exports. Of course, the next learning activity is to identify and explain the underlying philosophies of different theories of international trade. Theories of international trade tend to explain the nature and movement of international trade. Such theories can be classified into classical country-based theories, i.e., mercantilism, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and the Heckner-Ohlin theory. So these are looking at international trade from the context of a country. It could be a mercantilist country. It could be a country that is looking for absolute advantage. It could be a country that is looking for comparative advantage. And we're going to unpack mercantilism, absolute advantage, and especially competitive advantage. These are some of the foundational knowledge in understanding how economies can be competitive despite lack of high technology endowments. So, theory of mercantilism. This theory prevailed during the 16th to 19th centuries, as we had previously discussed. The wealth of a nation in this theory is measured based on its accumulated wealth in terms of gold and silver. Mercantilism also calls on nations to accumulate wealth by encouraging exports and discouraging imports. This initially can sound like a good idea, but logic will determine later that it's actually ultimately unhelpful to all parties. Again, if you're the only wealthy person in your town and you have a big old supermarket, you're not going to make much money because there isn't anybody with any real money that could buy stuff from your supermarket. So you can see how you want others to do well too, so they have the capacity to consume. And in fact, if they're doing well fixing cars, now you get a good place to go fix your car, as an example. But if you were, so obviously this is a micro example, but when you zoom out, that is actually the same principle and the same logic that obtains on a macroeconomic level. So when mercantilists call for accumulation of wealth by encouraging export, so they want to sell to people, but they're discouraging imports. They don't want people to sell to them. That can lead to the same example as I highlighted with the, well-to-do person with a supermarket. Theories of mercantilism aims to create trade surplus, which in turn accumulates a nation's wealth. Trade surplus, in case if you're wondering, is if you are country A and I am country B, if I'm selling more stuff to you than you are selling to me, then I have a trade surplus. And that's in isolation a good thing for me. Except as we will soon find out, ultimately it may not be so good for me because God forbid things become difficult for you, you will no longer be able to participate. You would now lack the capacity to engage in trade. And once you lack the capacity to engage in trade, I could have the finest ware in the world, but I will not have anybody that can afford them, in which case I'll begin to become poor myself as well. And this is where we come into comparative advantage and absolute advantage, as we will soon get to. So, spoke too soon. So now realize the logic. If I sell more stuff to you consistently than you sell to me, I have a trade surplus. But eventually it would make you poorer. And if you become too poor that you're unable to engage in trade, then I will become poor because I have nobody to buy my good stuff that I want to sell, whichever they may be. For purposes of economics, we call it widgets. So widgets could be X. It's just X, whatever it is you're buying. So here is how to think about this dynamic with using the theory of absolute advantage. This phrase, and this is one of those phrases that I really wish you would write down and add it to your vocabulary, and really the signal that you have a technical understanding of economics. And it also signals to your audience that you are coming with a unique set of skills. These are not the ordinary man's language. This is the language of a scholar from Medgar Evers Scholar. So absolute advantage theory, it originates by Adam Smith, a 18th century philosopher and economist. An inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth of nations in 1776. When a country, so in essence, absolute advantage means this. When one country can produce a unit of good with less cost, cheaper and faster, in other words, than another country, the first country has an absolute advantage in producing that good. I'm going to go back to an example that I gave last class, and we're going to use that as a standard. Let's say we are the United States. Let's say we can manufacture flip-flop cheaper and faster than all the countries in the Caribbean, as an example. That would mean that the United States has an absolute advantage against the Caribbean countries in the manufacture of flip-flops. Now, let's put that in a box and unpack the next thing, which is comparative advantage. Remember, this is absolute advantage. Comparative advantage originated it was originated by David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1817. And here is what it says. Nations can still gain from trade even without an absolute advantage. Remember the example that I gave, where the United States has an absolute advantage in the manufacture of flip-flops against Caribbean countries. And let's just say that these are the two regions of the world. The question then becomes, of what benefit then would it present to the Caribbeans to engage in international trade when the United States has an absolute advantage? Because they're going to make all the flip-flops because they can make them faster and cheaper. And if the Caribbeans try to make flip-flops, then it will be too expensive and nobody will buy it because they're not as efficient as the United States in manufacturing flip-flops. But the theory of comparative advantage says, nope, not so fast. Caribbean countries can still participate and benefit in international trade despite the United States having an absolute advantage in the manufacture of flip-flops. And here's how that works. A country has comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good in terms of other goods is lower in that country compared to the other country. Let me say that again. A country has a comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good in terms of other goods is lower in that country compared to other countries. Comparative advantage focuses on the relative productivity differences, whereas absolute advantage looks at the absolute productivity. So let's unpack what we mean by relative productivity differences versus absolute productivity. So the United States can pay workers $15 an hour to make flip-flops. Well, that means nobody in the Caribbean would likely afford it because they don't really make anything we can buy. So what are they gonna sell to make money to be able to buy our flip-flops? And this is holding all factors constant, of course, because flip-flop would not be the only widget in the global economy. But for the purposes of creating clarity, let's hold other factors constant. So we have an absolute advantage in manufacture of flip-flop. However, we as the United States have choices too. We can pay folks $15 an hour to manufacture flip-flops, or we can pay them $50 an hour and train them on how to manufacture Boeing airplanes and make Chevrolet trucks and make Cadillacs. Whereas, because while the Caribbeans cannot make flip-flops as efficiently as we can, they can make it cheaper than we can because their currency is weaker than US dollar. So the rational thing to do then will be to say to countries in the Caribbean, You manufacture the flip-flops. We're not even going to bother with that. We are going to go up what they call the value chain and make planes and make cars. They're up the value chain because they require more technical skills and they pay better. So now we can afford to make more money and then have the Caribbean sell us flip-flops, which we can afford to buy. And because they are selling us flip-flops, they can afford to buy Chevys and Fords. And this is how countries can participate in international trade in spite of the fact that they may lack absolute advantage. They're able to utilize comparative advantage to still attract investment and be able to participate in international commerce. Now, the next theory is endowment theory, the Haskell-Ollin model, and it's about factor proportions. According to this theory, a nation will export the commodity whose production requires intensive use of a nation's relatively abundant and cheap factors, and import the commodities whose production requires intensive use of the nation's scarce and expensive factors. I remember, so this follows the same logic. Let's say, for instance, Jamaica has bauxite, and bauxite is the key material in making aluminum. It really would not make much sense if the United States, that does not have a lot of bauxite, decides to start making aluminum. So, according to the factor proportions theory, it would argue that we're better off having Jamaica, dig up the bauxite that they have in abundant a reserve, turn it into input products that can be used to make all things aluminum. And maybe they're even going to sell us the finished aluminum that we're going to add as we build Boeing planes and as we make Cadillacs and Chevys. So this is factor proportions theory. Countries should concentrate on making or building goods that leverage resources that they have in abundant numbers or cheaply, and then sell those goods to other countries who do not have those factors in abundant numbers or cheaply. So now, in addition to the Caribbean countries making flip-flops, Jamaica is also now digging up bauxite. And if it begins to set up industrialization, it will have the capacity to turn the raw bauxite into input aluminum for products that will be purchased by car manufacturers in the United States and plane manufacturers in the United States, among other markets. And in this way, Jamaica will be taking advantage of its factor proportions. So on the other hand, modern firm-based theories include country similarity, product life cycle, global strategic rivalry, and Porter's national competitive advantage. This just sounds like a bunch of words. So let's unpack them a little bit. Product life cycle theory states that international markets tend to follow a cyclical pattern due to a variety of factors over a period of time, which explains the shifting of markets as well as the location of production. Of note, the level of innovation and technology, resources, size of the market, and competitive structure influences trade patterns. And I will give you one quick example, and it really pains me to leave this well set up context of US versus Caribbean countries. But just stepping out of that zone in a second. And it says that the level of innovation and technology resources, and size of market and competitive structure can influence trade patterns. In the first quarter of this year, and I'm sure most of the class have heard of Tesla to make electric cars, and up until the fourth quarter of 2023, Tesla was the largest by number of volume, that is, i.e., number of cars sold, the largest electric car manufacturer. A Chinese electric car company called Build Your Dreams, BYD, last year, by the fourth quarter of 2023, overtook Tesla to become the largest by volume electric car manufacturer. Again, volume means the number of cars that you sell. Now, this is phenomenal because Tesla is ubiquitous to electric cars. But what is even more revealing about BYD's dominance is that BYD, which is Build Your Own Dreams, a Chinese electric car manufacturer, was able to become the largest electric car seller when 90% of its sales were to China alone. And I say this because to underscore the point made here that the size of the market and the competitive structure can influence trade. So think about this. A car company that sells 90% of its cars in only China became the largest electric car manufacturer. Imagine if that car were to capture 15, 20% of global market share. This is only possible because of the level of innovation and the size of the Chinese market. And we can have a conversation about the innovation in China, whether it's competitive and all the other stuff. But that's a conversation for another day. In addition, the gap in technology and preference and the ability of customers in international markets also determine the stage of international production life cycle. So, theory of competitive advantage of international trade, as propounded by Michael Porter in The Competitive Advantage of Nations. The theory of competitive advantage, as I said, concentrates on a firm. Remember, we said absolute and comparative advantage. Those refer to national economies. Remember, I said that the United States may have an absolute advantage in manufacturing flip-flop, but that Caribbean countries may have a comparative advantage, which is they can manufacture it more cheaply. The third phrase that you need to be aware of is competitive advantage. Now, this speaks to individual firms within an economy. So, as I mentioned, Tesla and BYD, this will be in reference to individual companies such as Tesla in the United States or BYD in China. I should also note that that BYD had maintained Tesla had maintained its market dominance by selling many cars all over the world. And that's why it contrasts very sharply with BYD that was able to overtake Tesla while selling almost all of its cars in China alone. That's really a big difference. That speaks to the size of the Chinese market. So the model of competitive advantage is often referred to as the diamond model, wherein four determinants interact with each other. So when you say a company has competitive advantage, that means it can outcompete its competitors. There are four major determinants that often inform or underscore this competitive advantage. These include factor conditions, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. So let's quickly unpack, since we're on BYD, the factor conditions that has given BYD its core competitive advantage. Research suggests that most of many most that there are two hesitations. There are two factors that create hesitation in the adoption of electric cars. The first factor is the cost. They cost much more than their internal combustion engine counterpart. The second is range anxiety, because there isn't too many places, at least not a, we don't have as many place charging stations as we have petrol gas stations. So this creates range anxiety. The other factor is that it takes about 5 minutes, no more than 10 minutes, you fill up your tank and you're done, if that much. But with charging a car, it takes at least 25 to 30 minutes if it's really fast charge. But the factor conditions that has helped BYD is because the Chinese government had a state strategy to have market leadership in electric cars. They knew and understood that legacy manufacturers from Europe, Western Europe, and North America were far ahead of where the Chinese could ever find themselves in the manufacture of internal combustion engines, i.e., cars that burn Jurassic juice, gasoline or diesel. So they invested in electric car research. They invested in the charging network and infrastructure. They incentivized disincentivized companies to produce electric cars. So these are factor endowments that legacy car manufacturers have not enjoyed. Up until now, the Biden administration is investing about, I think, a little over $7 billion to build out charging networks in the United States. But this is, the Chinese are way ahead of the United States. So these created factor conditions. There were also demand conditions. And part of what I committed to in this class was that I was going to try to remove this class and remove the conversations in this class from theories to practice. And that's what I'm attempting to do. So we will not just discuss demand conditions. We're going to try to apply demand conditions to real life situations where it would hopefully employ logic. So on the demand side, so now the Chinese government has made it easier for manufacturers to manufacture electric cars because the government invested in charging stations. The government funded R&D, research and development in battery technology. But now you're building them. You have to now create demand. Just as we are now doing, or at least as we do here in the United States, the Chinese government started providing tax incentive for folks to buy electric. So that stimulated demand. That's the second factor, how BYD got to be where it is. The third is related and supporting industries. So this is what they call the value chain. If you're making electric cars, you're going to need access to rare earth materials that are used to make batteries, lithium, and the rest. Chinese have an abundance of them. China has an abundance of them. You're going to need the industry that builds batteries and electric motors, the whole supply chain network that leads to parts that are then used to build electric cars. Those are in abundant supply in China. So we can actually see these economic theories in place in China and seeing the application of these economic theories creating market dominance for China. So this is just not an abstract subject that we are studying. Now you could have an understanding, a technical understanding for why Chinese electric car companies are doing well, as an example. Then obviously, firms have to have a strategy. They have to have structure and they have to have rivalry. And we just mentioned the Tesla BYD rivalry. And BYD has a strategy. For instance, They don't want to sell cars in the United States until they have manufacturing footprint within the United States. And conversation for another day, we could go into why that's important, an important strategy. But the takeaway here is to understand these four phenomena, right? The four determinants, factor conditions, which is the government incentivizing charging stations, demand conditions, which is the Chinese government in this case, creating tax incentives for the purchase of electric cars, making car ownership easier because of an abundance of charging stations, related and supporting industries. As I mentioned, China has a bunch of lithium. They have battery manufacturing capacity. They have electric motor manufacturing capacity. And these are the core input products in an electric car. Then there are the individual companies themselves that have to develop a strategy. As I mentioned, BYD has an international market strategy, and their strategy, for good reason, but it's too detailed and takes us a little bit away from today's conversation. But their strategy, as one example, is not to enter the United States market until they have manufacturing footprint within the United States so they can enjoy US government subsidy and tax incentives. So the third is to identify, the third assessment, obviously, for this week is to identify the trend of development in international economic relations up to World War II. Yeah. So there has been trends in international development. And again, this is making, uh, uh, I'm trying to bring this whole subject back to reality. So the United States emerged from World War One as the world's largest industrial power and the only major net creditor. European countries were devastated by the mayhem of World War One and even more so in World War Two. At the end of World War One, because the war was fought in the continent of Europe and the damage was done on the continent of Europe, among other reasons, the United States emerged post World War One as the world's largest industrial power and the only largest creditor. Although it lent about $10 billion to cash short countries during the 1920s, some US policies did not facilitate a return to open liberal economy, and we all ended up paying for this. And when I mean we all, I mean the global economy. For example, the United States initially insisted that its close allies, Britain and France, repay all their war debt. And it imposed import barriers that made it difficult for Europeans to gain revenue from exports. So we loaned our closest ally, Britain and France, money, obviously because they were in bad shape because of the war. Fair enough, we also insist that they repay us all of their war debt. Okay, you got to pay your debt. However, we imposed import barriers. So Europeans couldn't sell things to us and therefore found it difficult to make money to be able to service their debts to us. Now, if you're a bank and you have a pocket full of money and you loan it to your customers and your customers are all broke, the bank is going to go under because your customers cannot pay you back. So this is really the same logic, right? If you're a country and you loan money to your allies and you insist that they pay you back, which is fair and proper and just, except you impose import barriers that make it difficult for them to trade with you and therefore raise the resources to be able to service that debt to you. That becomes problematic and becomes a race to the bottom for all parties. The 1922 Fordney-McComber Act raised U.S. custom duties. And when U.S. economy moved into depression after the 1929 stock market crash, the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act increased U.S. tariffs to the highest levels in 20th century. European states retaliated with their own import restrictions, and the world trade declined from 35 billion in 1929 to 12 billion in 1933. You can see the logic again that is a reoccurring theme in today's lecture. When you want to sell to people but you don't want to buy from them, eventually everybody becomes broke because even your customers no longer have money because they have nothing to sell to make money, so they can't buy anything from you. When Europe sets up, when we set up tariffs and barriers to trade, and Europe retaliates, nobody sells anything to anybody and everybody becomes poorer. That is why global trade by 1929 was what, 35 billion, because trade barriers had been set up on both sides of the Atlantic. 4 years later, in 1933, the value of global trade declined from 35 billion to 12 billion. So everybody became poorer. Another theory about why the global economy did poorly was because of hegemonic stability theorists who argued that the lack of a global hegemon, remember that used to be Britain, prevented the development of an open, stable international economy in a war period. This a little bit informs the debate that is being had today, especially in Washington, D.C., where the Senate passed a bill to fund the war to fund uh, um, Ukraine's ability to defend itself from Russia, restock Israel supplies, and also Taiwan. Forget the politics of the wars. The point is, this is what you call hegemon stability, right? The United States is stabilizing its allies. And the argument is that there was no clear-cut hegemon post World War One, and that is why the economy stuttered. There was no stabilizing force, as the United States Senate is attempting to do for its allies today. So now we get to the institutional framework. If you're going to provide stability, there has to be a framework to provide stability. There has to be institutions with a mandate and a bureaucracy to manage conflict and shape rules. So the institutional framework before World War II, most international organizations formed from 1815 to 1914 were designed to utilize technological innovation and promote economic regulation and commerce, mainly among European states. The first international organization, excuse me, the first international organization, the Bank of International Settlement, was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to oversee the settlement of German reparations after World War I. But its main purpose was to promote cooperation among central banks. We're going to get to what central banks, what they do in other classes, especially as we deal with the IMF. Other than BIS, international economic during its interwar period was mainly concerned with developing international standards for facilities, equipment, and installations required for the functioning of the global economy. These organizations were not able to deal with major economic problems such as the Great Depression. So now that we've set the context for why these institutions are important, part of the assessment for this week is that you have to be able to know these institutions, identify them, and know what their core functions are. So in July of 1944, delegates from 44 countries convened the Bretton Woods Conference. This is in New England, United States. And within 22 days, they endorsed a framework for the international economic cooperation after World War II. Two international economic organizations resulted from the Bretton Woods Conference. First is the International Monetary Fund. The IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort. And some of you began to work on your IMF assignment last week, but that's a whole different conversation. Is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national government and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. Its stated mission, that is the stated mission of the IMF, is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. We will have a class on IMF, and we're going to deep dive the IMF. But note, the IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. It now plays a central role in managing balance of the payments, difficulties, and international financial crisis. Through a quota system, countries contribute to funds to a pool from which countries can borrow if they experience balance of payment problems. Again, when we deal with the IMF in detail, we will get into the balance of trade. But essentially, it's a country's ability to finance international trade. The second institution that came from the Bretton Woods conference is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is now part of the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group, as many people don't know, this is actually not one bank. It is 5 different institutions that constitute, because their full name is the World Bank Group. The World Bank is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to government and private institutions of low and middle income countries for the purposes of pursuing capital projects. Its vision is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. The World Bank Group is a unique global partnership of 5 institutions working for sustainable solutions that reduce poverty and build shared prosperity in developing countries. These 5 institutions include the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, 2, International Development Association, IDA, 3, IFC, International Finance Corporation, 4, MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, 5, ICSID, the International Center for Settlement and Disputes. Now, it's important to note that the first 2 banks, the IBRD and the IDA, work with government, and the rest, IFC, MIGA, and ICSID, work with the private sector mostly. Then the third institution that came about was in 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade became the main global trading organization. GATT, as it was called, was set up to eliminate protectionism. As we said, people try to sell stuff to you, but they don't want to buy your stuff, which grinds the global economy to a halt. So GATT was set up to eliminate protectionism, get countries trading freely among themselves, and help restore economic prosperity following the devastation of the World War II. Accordingly, GATT was created to form rules to end or restrict the most costly and undesirable features of the pre-war protectionist period, namely quantitative trade barriers such as trade controls and quotas. GATT also provided a system to arbitrate commercial disputes among nations, and the framework enabled a number of multilateral negotiations for the reduction of trade barriers. Now, GATT was good, but GATT was more of an agreement than an institution. So in 1995, the GATT was superseded by the World Trade Organization, aka WTO. GATT, though largely successful in its goal, lacked a coherent institutional framework. In short, it was a legal agreement acting as an international organization. The World Trade Organization incorporates the principles of GATT and is better positioned to carry them out because, among other things, it is better versed in issues like intellectual property and has a faster dispute settlement mechanism, and it wields more power. Significantly, WTO rules are applicable to services and aspects of intellectual property along with goods. So GATT essentially dealt more with goods, trade in goods. But WTO also focuses on trade in services such as call centers and the like, and management advisory, and also intellectual property rights. The other significant institution that we want to know about is the United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations and was established after World War II. And this charter was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California, and it took effect on 24th October 1945. We are going to delve into the United Nations in the weeks ahead. But I try to keep classes to less than 45 minutes. And we are pushing up on about 55 minutes. So I will just end by saying this, that the two main components are, one of the key phrases again that I want you to learn this week is balance of payment, BOP. It's also known as the balance of international payments, is a settlement of all transactions made between countries. So when we sell Caribbean countries planes and cars, and they sell us zinc and flip-flops as an example, how much money do they have when they buy our stuff to pay us back? And if they don't have enough of it, then they got to go to the IMF. And this is really how we transition to conversations about institutions and the IMF. But this is at the core of our class this week. Just a quick reminder that just as yesterday, next week, Monday, would also be a holiday, and that will be in honor of President's Day. Typically, the announcement for the class assessment comes out on Monday morning by midnight, 12 a.m. Monday morning. But because Monday is a holiday, next week, Monday is a holiday, as was yesterday, that announcement would appear 12 a.m. Tuesday morning because Monday is a holiday. And with that, let me foreshadow next week's lecture by confirming that Module 4, which is next week, will be on the major institutions for managing world trade. And by we, I mean me, have to do a better job at getting us to 45 minutes. But there was just a lot of stuff to get through here. And I'd much rather cover it in the video so that folks can go back, read, and listen to the class lecture as necessary, because this is really setting up the history that has led to the international order that exists today and how we got here and why we got here. So this is really at the core of this week's class, and it's been really a pleasure to teach this class and be your professor today. And with that, I'm going to end the recording and we can go into questions and other housekeeping matters. Thank you.